Victoria Sterling threw the pink termination notice onto the wet pavement of the executive parking lot and told Elias Thorne that he would never work in the automotive industry again. The paper fluttered near his boots as a cold November rain began to soak into his canvas jacket. Elias did not move to pick it up. He simply tightened his grip on his daughter's hand while she clutched a one-eared stuffed cat against her chest. Victoria adjusted the collar of her designer blazer and looked at Elias with a narrow gaze that suggested he was already a ghost to her. "You are finished, Elias," she said with a voice that carried over the rhythmic splashing of the nearby fountain. "Take your scrap metal ideas and your broken life somewhere else, because Sterling Tower has no room for failures." Elias looked up at the 40-story glass monument he had helped maintain for over a decade. His knuckles were stained with the permanent grease of a man who understood the internal heartbeat of every machine in that building. Victoria signaled for the security team to approach while she stepped into the back of a waiting black sedan. Lily looked up at her father with eyes that were glassy but determined to remain steady. "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" she whispered as the car sped away and splashed water onto her small shoes. Elias crouched down until he was at her eye level and straightened the collar of her coat with fingers that were rough but incredibly gentle. "No, Lily," he said as he watched the luxury car disappear into the gray traffic of the city. "We just found the door we were looking for." He stood up and took one last look at the lobby where executives in tailored suits were already looking through him as if he were part of the scenery. Beneath the canvas of his jacket, Elias felt the weight of his final paycheck and a single brass key to a warehouse on the edge of town that everyone else had forgotten. For years, he had watched Victoria Sterling prioritize quarterly projections over the raw engineering that had built her father's empire. He had seen the flaws in their newest prototypes and had spent his nights drafting solutions that Victoria had called worthless and dated. The silence in the parking lot was heavy as the last few engineers finished their shifts and walked past Elias without making eye contact. Fear of Victoria's temper was a stronger currency in this building than loyalty. Elias turned his back on the tower and began the long walk toward the bus stop, with Lily skipping slightly to keep up with his pace. He knew that the very patents and engine parts Victoria was preparing to sell for pennies to clear her tax debt were the keys to a future she couldn't imagine. As they reached the corner, Elias looked down at the one-eared cat in Lily's arms and saw where the stitching was starting to come loose again. He realized that building an empire wasn't about the glass and the marble, but about the things people threw away because they didn't have the patience to fix them. Before we go on, have you ever been judged by someone who didn't know your true value? And tell me where you're watching from. The bus ride back to their small apartment was quiet except for the rattling of the heater and the soft hum Lily made as she tried to fix the loose stitches on her cat with a plastic hair clip. Elias watched the rain smear the city lights into long, distorted streaks against the window. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold metal of the brass key. It belonged to a small industrial unit in a neglected corner of the industrial district that he had purchased 3 years ago using a modest inheritance from his father. At the time, he had no plan for it other than a place to store the prototype parts he couldn't bring himself to discard. Now it was the only thing he owned besides the clothes on his back and the final paycheck resting in his wallet. Victoria Sterling was right about one thing. Sterling Tower had no room for failures, but she had failed to see that the blueprints he carried in his mind were the very foundation her father had built the company on. When they finally reached their street, Elias led Lily past the darkened storefronts and up the narrow stairs of their building. He made her a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup while he stared at the red termination stamp on his final pay stub. Lily finished her meal and set her toy on the table between them. "Will the lady with the car take our home too?" she asked with the blunt honesty of a child. Elias reached across and touched her hand. "She can't take what we build, Lily. She only took what she didn't understand." He spent the next 3 hours packing his old drafting tools and a stack of weathered technical journals into 2 heavy crates. Elias Thorne was not a man who shouted when he was angry. He was a man who became very still and very focused. The following morning, he took Lily to her preschool and drove his aging truck to the industrial park. The gate to the warehouse groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a space filled with dust and the scent of old engine oil. In the center of the room sat a massive tarp-covered shape. Elias pulled the heavy plastic back to reveal the V-Series prototype. It was the same engine Sterling Corp had recently decommissioned, claiming the design was too expensive to stabilize for mass production. Victoria had authorized its sale to a local scrap dealer for less than $500. Elias had intercepted the sale and bought it himself, knowing the flaw wasn't in the design, but in the shortcuts Victoria had forced the engineering team to take. He ran his hand over the cold cylinder head. For 10 years he had worked for the Sterlings, and for 10 years he had kept the real secrets of the V-Series in a locked drawer. He spent his first night in the warehouse under the glow of a single halogen work lamp. Elias stripped the engine down to its core components until his hands were black with carbon and his back ached from the strain. He worked with a precision the high-speed factory lines in the tower could never replicate. By dawn, he had found the hairline fracture in the fuel intake manifold that had baffled 60 different engineers. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a cold clarity. While Victoria Sterling was preparing to announce a new line of vehicles to the board, Elias was already tightening the bolts on a machine that would make her entire inventory obsolete. He knew the clock was ticking because Sterling Corp was already bleeding cash from their failed prototypes. Elias sat on a wooden stool and watched the first light of morning hit the steel. He was finished with their world, but he was just beginning his own. The sound of a car pulling into the gravel lot outside broke his concentration. Elias looked toward the heavy metal door as a shadow fell across the concrete floor. Victoria Sterling had not found him yet, but someone else had. He stood up and wiped his hands on a rag as the door creaked open. Elias Thorne was no longer an employee. He was a competitor who owned the only thing Victoria Sterling now desperately needed to survive. Elias watched the figure silhouette against the blinding morning light in the warehouse doorway. He set the heavy torque wrench on the metal workbench with a dull thud that echoed through the hollow space. Samuel Clark stepped into the room while closing a long black umbrella. The attorney was 60 years old and wore a charcoal wool coat that looked out of place against the grease-stained concrete floor. He did not look around the dusty warehouse with judgment, but kept his focus entirely on Elias. "I heard Victoria Sterling escorted you out personally," Samuel said as he moved toward the center of the room. Elias wiped his hands on a dark rag and glanced at the V-Series prototype. "She did," Elias replied. The lawyer stopped 10 feet away and looked at the engine sitting under the halogen lamp. He noticed the fuel intake manifold had been completely disassembled and laid out on a clean white cloth. Samuel had represented the Thorne family for 3 decades and knew that when Elias became silent, he was most dangerous to his enemies. "Sterling Corp is in trouble, Elias," Samuel stated while pulling a thin tablet from his leather briefcase. The company had attempted to launch the second phase of their urban transport line, but the engines were seizing at high speeds. Victoria was publicly blaming the legacy designs of the previous administration to hide the fact that she had slashed the testing budget by 40%. Elias picked up a small metal component and turned it over in his rough fingers. He knew exactly where the weakness lived because he had seen the stress fractures in his sleep for months. "I warned them about the manifold vibration," Elias said quietly. Samuel nodded and displayed a graph on the tablet screen showing the Sterling stock price in a steep downward slide. The board members were starting to ask questions that Victoria couldn't answer with a marketing slogan. While the city saw a failing empire, Elias saw a structural opportunity. He led Samuel to the back of the warehouse where dozens of crates were stacked to the ceiling. Each one was labeled with a Sterling Parts Division stamp and dated from the last 3 years. Victoria had authorized the disposal of these units because they were considered non-functional inventory. Elias had purchased them through a third-party shell company for less than the price of the raw aluminum. He pried open the nearest crate to reveal a perfectly preserved transmission assembly. She wanted to clear the books, so she threw away the foundation, Elias remarked while adjusting his cap. He had spent his modest inheritance not on a house or a new life, but on the very components Victoria Sterling had deemed worthless. Samuel looked at the massive inventory and realized the scale of the plan. Elias Thorne was not just a mechanic in a garage. He was now the owner of every critical replacement part in the Sterling supply chain. The attorney checked his watch and noted that the Sterling annual shareholder meeting was only 48 hours away. Victoria was preparing to announce a total recall that would cost the company $90 million. Elias sat on a wooden stool and looked at a framed photo of Lily taped to his toolbox. She was holding her one-eared cat and smiling in the sunlight. He wasn't building an empire for the money or the title. He was building it so that no one would ever be able to tell his daughter they were finished again. "Tell the board I'm ready to talk," Elias said. Samuel closed his briefcase with a sharp click. The silence in the warehouse felt like the breath before a storm. Elias picked up his tools and turned back to the V-Series prototype while the shadow of the legal giant moved toward the door. The man Victoria Sterling had broken was about to become the only person who could save her. The warehouse grew smaller as Elias moved through the narrow aisles of stacked crates, while the echo of the closing door still lingered in the air. He found Lily sitting on a small wooden bench he had constructed for her near the back office area. She was carefully coloring a picture of a mountain range using a set of blunt crayons, while her one-eared cat sat guard on the edge of the table. Elias adjusted the straps of her backpack and checked the time on his weathered watch. It was nearly 8 in the morning, and the city was waking up to a reality Victoria Sterling had spent millions of dollars trying to suppress. He walked back to the center of the warehouse where the V-Series prototype sat like a silent patient awaiting surgery. For the last 3 years, he had lived a double life as a senior engineer by day and a strategic collector of Sterling failures by night. Every time Victoria ordered a production line to skip a stress test or authorized a cheaper alloy, Elias had noted the serial numbers. He had waited for the inevitable moment when the accounting department would flag the defective inventory as a total loss. When that day came, he was the anonymous buyer waiting at the end of the paper trail. Elias picked up a specialized calibration tool and began measuring the thermal expansion gaps on the engine block. He knew that within 48 hours the first wave of Sterling urban transports would begin to stall on the highways of Chicago and Los Angeles. Victoria had built her public image on the idea of indestructible innovation, but she had forgotten that physics does not respect a marketing budget. A soft knock at the side entrance broke the silence of the industrial park. Elias did not reach for his wrench this time, but moved with the steady pace of a man who had invited the visitor. He opened the heavy steel door to find Marcus Miller standing on the gravel. Marcus was the lead union representative for the Sterling assembly plants, and he looked at Elias with a mixture of exhaustion and desperate hope. He handed Elias a thick manila folder containing the latest internal testing logs that Victoria had tried to shred. Elias flipped through the pages and saw the red ink marking the catastrophic failure points. "The board is meeting at noon," Marcus said while glancing nervously at the black SUV parked at the far end of the street. "Victoria is going to tell them the V-Series was a legacy mistake from your department." Elias looked at the man and saw the fear for 1,000 jobs reflected in his eyes. He realized that Victoria wasn't just firing individuals anymore, but was preparing to dismantle the very hands that had built the company. Elias closed the folder and walked back to the stacks of crates. He used a crowbar to pry the lid off a long rectangular box near the bottom of the pile. Inside lay a secondary cooling system that he had redesigned in his spare time 2 years ago. It was a component Victoria had called an unnecessary expense during the initial launch. He touched the polished surface and felt the cold reality of his leverage. Sterling Corp isn't failing because of legacy designs, Marcus, Elias stated while looking at the prototype. It is failing because they threw away the only parts that worked. He knew that Victoria would soon discover her supply chain had been hollowed out from the inside. She was holding the keys to the building, but Elias Thorne now held the keys to every vehicle they had ever sold. The man who had been cast out into the rain was now the only one with a dry place to stand. Elias turned to Marcus and told him to gather the senior technicians for a meeting that wouldn't happen in a boardroom. The storm was no longer approaching, but had already arrived at the gates of Sterling Tower. Elias picked up his torque wrench and began the final assembly of the engine Victoria Sterling had sworn was dead. He looked at Lily, who was now humming a quiet tune, while her toy cat watched her work. Elias Thorne was building something much larger than a machine. He was building an empire out of the very pieces Victoria had deemed worthless. The first gear turned with a precision that vibrated through the concrete floor. The empire was no longer a plan, but a physical reality moving in the shadows. Elias waited for the phone call he knew would come before the sun set. He was ready to show Victoria Sterling exactly what she had finished when she threw him out. Victoria Sterling adjusted her silk tie in the reflection of the glass boardroom table while 30 executives waited for her to speak. The room was silent and pressurized like the inside of an engine about to seize. On the large digital display behind her, a heat map of the United States showed hundreds of flashing red icons concentrated in major metropolitan areas. Each icon represented a Sterling urban transport vehicle that had stalled on a high-speed freeway in the last 12 hours. The disaster was no longer a theoretical risk in a lab, but a public collapse of the company reputation. Victoria tapped a gold pin against the table and looked at her chief technology officer, who refused to meet her gaze. The manifold failures are occurring exactly where the diagnostic reports predicted 3 months ago, the officer admitted with a voice that was thin and strained. He placed a printed internal memo on the table which had been authored by Elias Thorne. Victoria looked at the date on the document and realized it was the same week she had slashed the testing budget to increase the quarterly dividend. She remembered the way Elias had tried to speak to her in the parking lot, and the way she had tossed his career onto the wet pavement without a second thought. The board members began to murmur while one senior investor leaned forward with a look of cold calculation. If we cannot source the stabilized manifolds and cooling assemblies by tomorrow morning, we will have to file for a total recall, he stated firmly. Victoria knew that a recall of this magnitude would cost $90 million and effectively end her tenure as CEO. She ordered her assistant to contact every primary supplier in the tri-state area, but the response was the same from every office. All existing surplus inventory of the older reliable components had been purchased 6 months ago by a private entity known as Thorne Dynamics. Victoria felt a strange hollowness in her chest as the name registered in her mind. She checked the registration details of the warehouse where Thorne Dynamics operated and saw the address in the industrial district. It was the same corner of the city she had told Elias to disappear into. While the executives argued about legal liabilities, Victoria stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. She looked out at the city and saw the distant plume of smoke from a stalled transport on the interstate 5 miles away. Her empire was built on the belief that people were interchangeable parts, but she was learning that some foundations cannot be replaced. She turned back to the room and told her security detail to bring the car around. "I am going to handle this personally," she said with a tone that allowed no further discussion. She drove through the industrial park past rusted fences and gray concrete slabs until she found the warehouse with the groan of a heavy metal gate. Victoria stepped out of the luxury sedan and felt the grit of the gravel under her designer heels. She pushed open the side door and saw Elias Thorne standing under a single work lamp. He was tightening a bolt on a V-Series engine that roared with a precision she had never heard in the factory. Lily was sitting on a crate nearby while she carefully stitched a new eye onto her stuffed cat with a silver needle. Elias did not look up when Victoria entered. He simply finished his turn and set the wrench down with a deliberate click. "I told you that you were finished, Elias," Victoria said while her voice echoed against the stacks of crates containing her own company failures. Elias wiped his hands on a greasy rag and looked at her with eyes that were no longer tired but incredibly sharp. He picked up the original pink termination notice from his workbench and held it out toward her. The paper was wrinkled and stained, but the ink was clear. Elias Thorne was not waiting for an apology because he was busy holding the only thing that could stop the fire in her tower. Victoria Sterling stared at the wrinkled paper Elias held toward her while the low thrum of the prototype engine vibrated through the soles of her shoes. The grease on his fingers had left a dark smudge near the word termination, but the bold black letters of her own signature remained a sharp indictment of her previous arrogance. She did not reach out to take the notice. Her hands remained at her sides, and her fingers curled into tight fists as she looked from the paper to the man she had dismissed as a relic of a bygone era. Elias lowered his arm and placed the paper back on the workbench next to a set of precision calipers and a worn technical manual. He did not offer her a chair or a glass of water. He simply waited for her to bridge the silence that he had spent years preparing for. Victoria took a single step closer to the V-Series engine and noticed how the intake manifold had been reinforced with a custom alloy sleeve that caught the harsh light of the halogen lamp. It was a surgical fix for a terminal disease. "You bought the entire surplus of manifolds 6 months ago," Victoria said as her voice cracked slightly under the weight of the warehouse rafters. Elias picked up a clean cloth and began wiping the oil from his knuckles with slow and methodical movements. He looked toward the back of the warehouse where Lily was now carefully lining up her crayons in a perfect row according to their color. "I bought what Sterling Corp called scrap metal, Victoria," Elias replied while his gaze returned to the woman in the expensive blazer. He explained that he had watched her father build the company on the principle of over-engineering, but she had tried to run it on the principle of subtraction. Victoria felt a cold draft from the open bay door as she realized that every transport vehicle currently stalling on the interstate required the very parts Elias was currently leaning against. She looked at the stacks of crates and tried to calculate the logistics of a buyback, but the numbers in her head refused to align with the reality of the situation. She wasn't here to negotiate a contract. She was here to negotiate for the survival of her name. "The board is demanding a solution by 5 in the evening," Victoria stated while looking at the steady blue flame of a soldering iron on the far bench. She told him that the company could offer him a consulting fee that would dwarf his previous decade of earnings. Elias did not flinch at the mention of money. He walked over to Lily and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder while the little girl looked up and smiled at him. "My daughter asked me if we were going to lose our home the day you threw us out," Elias said with a voice that was level but carried the weight of a physical blow. Victoria looked away and her eyes landed on the one-eared cat that Lily was now hugging tightly against her chest. She saw the silver needle still threaded through the fabric of the toy and recognized that repair was a labor of love rather than a line item on a spreadsheet. The high heels that had felt like armor in Sterling Tower now felt like a liability on the dusty floor. Elias turned back to the prototype and adjusted the fuel mixture until the roar of the engine smoothed into a whistle that filled the cavernous space. He looked at Victoria Sterling and saw the cracks in her composure that no amount of marketing could fill. Elias Thorne wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was the architect of the only bridge left standing. Elias leaned over the workbench and picked up a black ledger book filled with years of serialized data and component locations. He tapped the cover with his grease-stained thumb and looked Victoria directly in the eyes. "I don't want your money, Victoria," Elias said while the warehouse fell into a heavy and expectant quiet. He told her that he wanted the one thing she had spent her entire career trying to steal from the people who actually did the work. Victoria felt the pressure in her chest tighten as she realized that the price of her empire was about to be paid in a currency she didn't know how to spend. The shadow of Elias Thorne grew long against the crates of failures as the afternoon sun began to dip below the industrial skyline. Victoria stood silent while the man she had finished began to dictate the terms of her new beginning. Elias closed the ledger with a sharp sound that signaled the end of the conversation. He had built an empire out of her waste, and now he was ready to show her exactly who was truly finished. Victoria Sterling remained motionless as the heavy metal ledger rested between her and Elias. The scent of ozone and cooling steel filled the warehouse while the late afternoon sun cast long orange bars across the floor. She looked at the smudged fingerprints on the black cover and realized that Elias was not interested in a paycheck. He was holding a record of every shortcut she had approved and every engineer she had silenced. Victoria reached for the handle of her leather handbag, but her fingers trembled slightly against the clasp. "What do you want, Elias?" she asked with a voice that had lost its sharp executive edge. Elias walked past her to the high warehouse windows and looked out at the industrial skyline. He pointed a grease-stained finger toward a row of transport trucks visible in the distance. "I want the Thorne name back on the patents your board stripped from my family 20 years ago," Elias said. Victoria felt the air in the room grow heavy as the weight of a generation of corporate theft landed on her shoulders. Her father had built Sterling Corp on the bones of Elias's family legacy, and she had maintained the empire by burying the truth in legal filings. Elias turned back to her, and his face was a mask of cold resolve under the flickering halogen light. He told her that Thorne Dynamics now held the exclusive manufacturing rights to the only fuel manifold that wouldn't shatter under freeway stress. Victoria checked the time on her watch and noted that she had less than 2 hours before the board meeting began. If she returned to the tower without a signed agreement, the directors would vote to remove her by sunset. Lily stood up from her crate and walked over to Victoria while holding the newly repaired cat in her small hands. The little girl looked at the CEO with eyes that were ancient in their understanding of loss. "My dad says the truth is like an engine," Lily whispered as she held up her toy. "If you don't fix the middle, the whole thing falls apart." Victoria looked at the silver stitching on the toy and saw the reflection of her own broken empire in the one-eared cat. She realized that Elias Thorne had spent 10 years waiting for her to fail, so he could finally show her how to build. Victoria opened her handbag and pulled out a gold fountain pen while her gaze met Elias's level stare. She didn't look for a desk, but leaned over the metal workbench next to the V-Series prototype. "Draft the restoration agreement, Elias," Victoria stated while her voice regained a different kind of strength. She told him that she would sign over the legacy rights in exchange for the immediate release of the manifold inventory. Elias did not rush to celebrate, but picked up the ledger and opened it to a blank page. He began writing terms in a steady and precise hand that showed no signs of hesitation. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper was the only noise in the cavernous space. Victoria stood by the engine and realized that the man she had called a failure was actually the architect of her survival. Elias finished the final line and turned the ledger toward her. He offered the gold pen back and watched her sign the document that would dismantle 40% of Sterling Corp's intellectual property. Victoria capped the pen and looked at the oil on her fingers with a strange sense of relief. She was no longer a CEO protecting a lie, but a partner in a truth she had spent her life running from. Elias picked up his phone and made a single call to the plant managers. Thorn Dynamics was no longer a secret in a warehouse, but the new heart of the city's transport industry. Elias walked Victoria to the door, and Lily gave a small wave with the paw of her cat. The man who had been cast out was now the one opening the door for the woman who had fired him. Victoria stepped into the gravel lot and looked back at the shadow of Elias Thorn. She knew the board meeting would be the most difficult hour of her life, but she finally had a foundation that wouldn't seize. Elias watched the black sedan pull away, and then he turned back to the machines. The throne was waiting at the tower, and he was ready to take it. Victoria Sterling stood in the center of the Sterling Tower boardroom, while 40 investors watched her through a screen of frozen silence. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the static energy of a failing empire. Victoria kept her hands flat on the polished mahogany surface to hide the tremble in her fingers as she looked at the empty seat that belonged to her chief financial officer. Minutes earlier, security had escorted Xavier from the building after the internal audit revealed the web of shell companies and diverted funds that had nearly strangled the organization. Victoria cleared her throat and adjusted the microphone while the lead investor leaned forward with a gaze like cold flint. "The recall has been suspended," Victoria stated with a voice that regained its steady command for the first time in months. She displayed a new technical schematic on the primary wall screen, which featured a fuel manifold bearing a serial number that didn't belong to any Sterling patent. The investors murmured as they saw the Thorn Dynamics logo etched into the virtual steel. Victoria explained that they were not just repairing their fleet, but were completely restructuring the core architecture using technology they had previously discarded. She did not mention the warehouse or the ring. She simply focused on the data Elias Thorn had provided in the black ledger. One elderly board member who had known Victoria's father leaned into his microphone while his eyebrows bunched together in confusion. "Thorn Dynamics owns the rights to our primary propulsion system," he asked with a tone that suggested the world had flipped on its axis. Victoria looked at the man and gave a single sharp nod. She told the room that they would be operating as a junior partner in a joint venture moving forward. The silence that followed was not one of defeat, but of profound realization. Victoria realized that her father had spent 20 years trying to bury the Thorn name, while Elias had spent 10 years waiting for the weight of that lie to crush the building. While the legal terms were being processed, Victoria stepped away from the table and walked to the glass balcony overlooking the lobby. She saw Elias Thorn standing near the entrance fountain with Lily and her toy cat. He wasn't wearing a suit or a badge, but he occupied the space with the gravity of a man who finally owned the ground he stood on. Victoria remembered how she had called him a failure in that exact spot and felt the sting of her own blindness. She signaled for her assistant to bring the new contract down to the floor. Victoria exited the elevator, and the staff parted like a tide as she moved toward the man in the canvas jacket. She did not lead with a handshake, but stopped 3 feet away and watched Lily point at the high ceiling. "The boardroom has ratified the agreement, Elias," Victoria said while the afternoon light caught the silver eye of the stuffed cat. Elias looked at the tower, and his face remained a calm mask of professional focus. He told her that his team would arrive at 5 in the morning to begin the assembly line overhaul. Victoria watched him pick up Lily and realized that the throne didn't belong to the person with the loudest voice, but to the one holding the truth. Elias Thorn had built an empire out of her mistakes, and now he was walking back into the tower to reclaim his legacy. Victoria stood by the fountain and watched the pair walk toward their aging truck as the first Sterling transport with a Thorn manifold purred to life in the distance. The foundation was finally solid, but the cost of the lesson was still settling in her chest. Elias didn't look back, but he knew exactly where the load-bearing walls were. He was no longer just a father in the shadows, but the new architect of everything they saw. Victoria Sterling watched the taillights of the old truck merge into the rhythmic pulse of the city traffic until they were nothing more than a faint amber glow against the darkening industrial district. The cooling warehouse behind her felt hollow and heavy with the scent of recycled air and old grease. She turned the silver eye of the stuffed cat over in her palm and registered the sharp bite of the metal against her skin. It was a physical reminder of a world she had spent her entire life trying to polish away. Victoria walked to her sedan and sat in the back seat while her driver waited for instruction. She looked at the smudges of oil on her sleeve and did not reach for a tissue. "Sterling Tower," she said quietly. The car moved through the streets while Victoria watched the reflections of neon signs dance across the dark glass. She realized that for years she had been managing a theater of success, while the actual structural integrity of her life was being held together by the man she had thrown into the rain. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor of the tower, the air felt thin and cold. Board members were gathered around the mahogany table with coffee cups and tablets while the red lights on the heat map continued to pulse like a slow fever. Victoria did not go to her seat at the head of the table. She walked directly to the primary screen and swiped the data away until only a single image remained, which was the original handwritten blueprint of the Thorn manifold. "The buyout of Thorn Dynamics is canceled," Victoria stated while her voice filled every corner of the silent room. Gerald leaned forward and started to mention the fiduciary risk, but Victoria cut him off with a single steady look. She explained that Sterling Corp was no longer a kingdom of solo decisions, but a partner in a legacy they had almost succeeded in destroying. She placed the signed restoration agreement on the table and watched as the investors read the terms that effectively split the empire in two. There was no anger in the room, but a strange and sudden stillness as the lie they had all lived finally collapsed. 1 month later, Victoria stood in the main lobby near the entrance fountain and watched a team of engineers in gray Thorn Dynamics work shirts move past the security desk. None of them looked at the marble with awe, but focused entirely on the equipment they were carrying. She saw Elias Thorn stop at the glass doors while holding Lily's hand. The girl was wearing a new bright yellow coat, and the stuffed cat was tucked securely under her arm with a reinforced leather strap. Victoria walked over and noticed that the cat had both eyes now, and the stitching was professional and permanent. "We start on the assembly line for overhaul at noon," Elias said while his gaze moved across the lobby to the station where he had once been forced to his knees. Victoria followed his eyes and realized that the space was no longer a place of humiliation, but a workshop. "I have updated the escalation protocols, Elias," Victoria replied while she adjusted her blazer. She told him that every engineer now had a direct line to her office because she finally understood that a building is only as strong as the people who know where the walls are. Lily looked up at the high ceiling and then at Victoria with a complete and uncomplicated smile. "My dad says you learn the hard stuff," Lily whispered as she held out a small drawing of a bird rising from a pile of gears. Victoria took the paper and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with her quarterly projections. She realized that the person who truly owns the tower is not the one with the name on the glass, but the one with the character to rebuild after the fall. Elias gave a small nod of professional respect and led Lily toward the elevators. Victoria stood by the fountain and watched them go while the first engine of the new Thorn Sterling transport line purred to life in the distance. The foundation was finally solid, and for the first time in her career, Victoria Sterling was not looking at the map, but at the truth. Elias Thorn had built an empire out of her waste, and in doing so he had taught her that nothing is ever truly finished until you give up on fixing it. The story ended in the late afternoon sun with a man reclaiming his dignity and a woman finding the vision she had lost in the glare of the lights.